how long was this going on, and was there a conflict that you saw? Because I think your perspective is so important, a conflict between the people who are running the show and the family in terms of what's best for Wendy?
I don't think no one knew exactly to the extent how bad it was. I felt like people knew something was up with her, but they didn't really know. I knew it because I've been around it, you know?
If you thought the Wendy Williams story could not get any darker, what is now being said about Kevin Hunter has people absolutely stunned. Because according to fresh online chatter, old whispers are being dragged back into the spotlight. And this time, the person allegedly speaking up is someone who knew Wendy long before the fame, long before the talk show, and long before Kevin ever became the man standing beside her in public, while, according to many critics, controlling everything behind the scenes. And that is exactly why this story is exploding right now. Because for years, fans have asked the same question over and over again. What really happened to Wendy Williams behind closed doors? How did one of the loudest, sharpest, most fearless women in media end up at the center of so much heartbreak, isolation, and chaos? And
my thyroid, my hyperthyroid, is attached also to Graves' disease. Graves' disease squeezes the muscles behind your eyeballs. And so that's the reason for...
Williams said it was her viewers who convinced her to get checked out.
Now, with new reports making rounds online, people are once again looking at Kevin Hunter with a whole different level of suspicion. Social media is in complete meltdown after claims started circulating that Wendy's ex from before Kevin allegedly had serious concerns about the kind of influence Kevin had over her life, her choices, and even her emotional stability. And if even half of these reports are true, then this is not just messy tea anymore. This would completely change the way people understand Wendy's downfall. Fans are shocked, old interviews are being rewatched, and every single clip of Kevin standing next to Wendy is suddenly being looked at differently. Because what once seemed like a husband protecting his wife is now, according to internet speculation, being interpreted as something much more disturbing. Was Kevin really helping Wendy, or was he allegedly helping himself the whole time? And why are people now saying that the warning signs were there from the very beginning? Because if what is being reported is even remotely close to the truth, then Wendy may have been surrounded by betrayal far earlier than anybody realized. Emotions are running high, the internet is picking sides, and the family is once again being dragged into a storm they probably hoped would stay buried. And trust me, by the time you hear what is now being alleged about what went on behind closed doors,
for some time now, and even today and beyond, I have been living in a sober house. I am driven by my 24-hour sober coach back to a home, lights out by 10 p.m., So I go to my room, and I stare at the ceiling, and I fall asleep to wake up to come back here to see you.
You might never look at this story the same way again. The conversation started quietly, almost like a whisper that nobody was supposed to hear. But somehow it found its way online and spread faster than anyone expected. People who had followed Wendy for years suddenly found themselves going back, replaying old clips, rewatching interviews, trying to connect dots that did not make sense before. And at the center of all this renewed attention was one question that refused to go away. What really happened behind closed doors during those early years when everything seemed perfect on the outside? According to reports now circulating, Wendy's first husband allegedly began opening up in private conversations, not in a flashy interview or a public rant, but in a way that felt more personal, more reflective. And that alone made people take it seriously, because this was not someone chasing headlines. This was someone who had stayed silent for years, someone who had watched from a distance as Wendy's life took turns that many could not explain. One source claimed that during a recent discussion, he spoke about how different things were back when he knew her, describing a version of Wendy that felt grounded, focused, and in control of her own path. There was a calmness in the way he reportedly described those early days, almost like he was remembering someone who had not yet been pulled into the chaos that would later define her story. She always knew what she wanted, he allegedly said, his voice described as steady but heavy with emotion. There was nothing confusing about her back then. She was sharp, she was driven, and she did not let anyone steer her life for her. Those words alone hit fans hard, because that was the Wendy they remembered too. The fearless voice on radio, the woman who said exactly what others were too afraid to say. But then, according to these same reports, his tone shifted when the conversation turned toward the time when Kevin entered her life. And this is where things started to feel different. He allegedly paused before speaking, as if choosing his words carefully, which only made what came next feel even more intense. I noticed changes, he reportedly said. Not all at once, but little by little. Things that didn't seem like a big deal at first, but over time, they added up. Fans are shocked by how subtle those early changes were described. It was not some dramatic overnight transformation. It was gradual, almost invisible unless you were paying close attention. A shift in energy, a difference in how she responded to things, moments where her usual confidence seemed to flicker. And according to the reports, he was not
only one who noticed. People who had worked around Wendy during that period have also started to come back into the conversation, with some online users pointing to old comments and interviews where colleagues hinted that something felt off long before the public ever caught on. Emotions ran high as fans began sharing these clips, analyzing every word, every expression, searching for signs that were missed at the time. But what really pushed this story into overdrive was the claim that these changes were not just random or personal struggles, but potentially linked to influence from someone close to her. There were moments where I felt like she was not fully herself, he allegedly continued, and it did not feel natural. It felt like something else was affecting her decisions, her mood, even her focus. That line alone has sparked endless debate online, because what does that really mean? Was it stress? Was it pressure? Or was it something deeper that people are only now starting to question? And then came the part that truly divided the internet. According to multiple online discussions, he allegedly suggested that Kevin's presence in her life was not as supportive as it appeared publicly. Instead, some are now interpreting his words as implying that Kevin may have had a stronger influence over her personal choices than anyone realized at the time. The reaction to this has been intense. Some fans are defending Kevin, saying that people are reading too much into vague statements and that relationships are always complicated from the outside looking in. But others are not convinced. They believe that these new claims align too closely with what they have suspected for years. "We saw it," one fan wrote in a viral comment. "We just did not want to believe it back then." That comment alone gained thousands of likes, showing just how many people are now reconsidering everything they thought they knew about Wendy's story. And it does not stop there. Because as more people began revisiting old footage, certain moments started to stand out in ways they never had before. Interviews where Wendy seemed slightly distracted, episodes where her energy felt different, public appearances where Kevin was always close by, often stepping in during moments that now feel more significant than they did at the time. "Watch how he answers for her," another user pointed out while sharing a clip that quickly went viral. "Why is he always the one speaking in certain situations?" Questions like these are what keep this story alive, because they open doors to interpretations that were not considered before. And once those doors are open, it becomes almost impossible to close them again. Still, not everyone is ready to accept these narratives. Some people are urging caution, reminding others that these are still just reports, that none of this has been confirmed, and that it is easy for stories to take on a life of their own once they hit the internet. But even with those reminders, the curiosity surrounding this situation continues to grow. Because at the end of the day, people are not just interested in drama. They're trying to understand how someone like Wendy, who once seemed unstoppable, ended up in such a complicated and heartbreaking situation. And now, with these new claims adding another layer to the story, the focus has shifted back to the past, to those early years that might hold more answers than anyone realized at the time. One source even claimed that the first husband allegedly tried to reach out during those years, not in a dramatic way, but out of genuine concern. "I just wanted to know if she was okay," he reportedly said. "That is all it was." That statement, simple as it is, has added an emotional weight to the story that makes it harder to ignore, because it suggests that there were people who saw something was wrong, even if they didn't fully understand what it was. And as fans continue to dig deeper, the timeline of events is being examined more closely than ever before. From the early days of her career to the height of her success, every moment is now being looked at through a different lens. Was everything really as it seemed on the surface? Or were there signs all along that something was not right? Because if these reports are pointing in the direction people think they are, then this story is not just about one relationship. It's about control, influence, and the possibility that the truth behind Wendy's journey may be far more complicated than anyone ever imagined. And just when it seemed like the conversation could not get any more intense, another claim started making rounds, one that would take everything people thought they understood and turn it into something even more unsettling. Another claim started making rounds, one that would think everything people thought they understood and turn it into something even more unsettling. Because according to the latest chatter online, the concern was never just about emotional distance or personality changes. Some people are now saying the real issue may have been how deeply Kevin allegedly inserted himself into every single part of Wendy's world, until there was barely any space left for her to move without him being involved. And that is where this story gets even more disturbing for people who have followed her rise from the beginning. Because when fans think back to Wendy's career, they remember a woman who built her name by being bold, unpredictable, and impossible to silence. She did not need someone else to create her identity. She was the identity. That is why the idea that anyone could slowly take control of her life feels especially painful to the audience that watched her become a media force. According to reports now circulating, Wendy's first husband allegedly described a pattern that did not look like love from the outside, but more like dependence being created over time. And that one detail has become one of the most talked about parts of this entire situation. It was almost like she stopped trusting her own instincts, he allegedly said. And if you knew who she was before, that stood out immediately. Those words hit hard online because they speak to something people understand without needing proof laid out in front of them. When a person who used to move with certainty suddenly starts second-guessing everything, people notice. And in Wendy's case, fans are now wondering whether those moments they once brushed off were actually signs of a much bigger problem forming behind the scenes. Social media has been flooded with side-by-side clips comparing different eras of Wendy's public life. In one, she is loud, sharp, and fully in command. In another, she seems drained, distracted, almost like she is carrying something heavier than what the cameras are capturing. And while no single clip proves anything, together they have created a narrative that many people can no longer ignore. What made matters worse was the way people close to the show allegedly behaved whenever questions came up. According to online speculation, there were whispers for years that staff members and people around the production noticed tension, but did not know how far they could go in speaking on it. Some are now revisiting old rumors that certain employees felt Kevin had too much power, not just as a husband, but as someone who allegedly positioned himself as the gatekeeper to everything involving Wendy. And if that is true, then it changes how people see a lot of old moments. Because suddenly, stories that once sounded like normal celebrity marriage tension start sounding like something much more strategic. One former insider, according to internet discussions, allegedly described the atmosphere around Wendy as careful, which is a word people have not stopped dissecting since it surfaced. Careful how? Careful around who? Careful because of what? The internet has done what it always does and turned one word into 1,000 theories. Nobody wanted to upset the system, one online user wrote while reacting to the report. And if he was the system, that tells you everything. That comment exploded because it captured exactly why this story feels so unsettling. If someone close to Wendy allegedly became the person everyone had to go through, then that means the line between support and control may have become dangerously blurred. And then there is the financial side of all this, which only makes people more suspicious. Because as these reports continue to spread, fans are once again bringing up old claims that Kevin was not just involved emotionally, but deeply tied into her career, business decisions, and money. And when someone has influence over your home life, your public life, and your financial life all at once, people start asking very serious questions. Was it partnership or was it power? That is the question a lot of fans cannot stop asking. Because if one person allegedly becomes the center of every decision, every conversation, every opportunity, then the relationship stops looking balanced. It starts looking like one person has all the leverage, while the other is left carrying the emotional consequences. According to reports, Wendy's first husband allegedly believes the shift happened earlier than most people realize. Not when the public scandals became impossible to hide, not when the headlines got ugly, but years before that, in quieter moments that did not make it onto television. People think these things begin when the world finally notices, he allegedly said, but usually by then it has already been going on for a long time. And that line right there has stayed with people, because it speaks to something deeply uncomfortable about how public downfalls often work. By the time viewers are reacting, the private damage may already be years old. Fans are shocked not just because of what is being said, but because of how much of it seems to line up with the emotional tone of Wendy's later years. Guarded interviews, the visible exhaustion, the moments where she seemed like she was trying to push through something bigger than what she was willing to say out loud. And for many people, the hardest part of this story is not even the alleged betrayal itself. It is the possibility that Wendy may have been trying to survive in a situation where the people around her either did not know how to help or did not feel safe stepping in. That is where the family angle enters and makes everything even more complicated. Because as these new reports continue to spread, people are once again debating who around Wendy knew what and when. Was her family aware that something was deeply wrong? Did they try to intervene? Were they shut out? Or did they only understand the full picture once things had already fallen apart? The family was left divided in the eyes of the public, especially as different voices over the years appeared to tell slightly different versions of what was going on. And that division is exactly what keeps these stories alive, because once loved ones are pulled into the public debate, every silence starts to look suspicious, and every statement gets analyzed for hidden meaning. One thing that keeps resurfacing is how isolated Wendy seemed at different points in her life, and that isolation is what many fans now see as one of the biggest red flags. When someone loses connection to the people who knew them before, that is usually not random, one viewer wrote under a viral clip. That is usually by design. Again, that is just speculation, but it is the kind of speculation that gains traction because it fits the emotional shape of the story people think they are seeing. And if that was the dynamic, if the reports are even partly accurate, then it would explain why so many people now feel a strange kind of guilt while looking back. Guilt for laughing off odd moments. Guilt for treating clear signs of distress like entertainment. Guilt for not realizing that the woman delivering everybody else's drama may have been living inside a storm of her own. And then, just as the internet was already spiraling, another detail began making the rounds that pushed the story into an even darker direction. Because some are now claiming that what happened in private may not have just affected Wendy emotionally or professionally, but may have played a role in changing how she saw herself altogether. And that possibility is what has people looking at one very specific period in her life in a completely different way. And that possibility is what has people looking at one very specific period in her life in a completely different way. Because once fans started revisiting the years when Wendy was still showing up, still smiling, still trying to keep the machine running, many began noticing something they could not unsee anymore. It was not just fatigue. It was not just stress. It was as if she was constantly trying to perform normal while carrying something much heavier underneath. And the more those clips resurfaced, the more the internet started asking whether the version of Wendy the audience was seeing was actually someone trying to hold herself together in an environment that had already become emotionally unsafe. According to reports now spreading online, Wendy's first husband allegedly suggested that one of the biggest changes he noticed over time was not simply in her behavior, but in the way she appeared to lose confidence in her own judgment. And that detail has struck a nerve because when someone as outspoken as Wendy begins shrinking emotionally, people notice that shift even if they cannot explain it in the moment. She used to stand on what she felt, he allegedly said. Later on, it felt like she was constantly adjusting herself around somebody else's energy. That line alone has been enough to send people into full breakdown mode online. Because if there is one thing the public always associated with Wendy, it was certainty. Even when she was messy, she was certain. Even when she was controversial, she owned it. So the idea that she may have spent years second-guessing herself behind closed doors is the part that has left fans the most shaken. And then came the old stories that people had not thought about in years. Stories about how Kevin was allegedly always present, always hovering, always somewhere in the background of important decisions, not just as a husband, but as someone who may have gradually become impossible to separate from her public image, her private routine, and her emotional reality. People are now replaying moments where Wendy spoke about her marriage with a tone that felt, in hindsight, strangely defensive. At the time, many viewers interpreted it as a woman standing by her man, but now those same clips are being viewed through a much darker lens. Because there is a big difference between defending your relationship and sounding like you are trying to convince yourself that everything is still under control. Fans are shocked by how many of those old moments now feel loaded with hidden tension. There are episodes where she laughed off rumors with a little too much force, interviews where her smile seemed slightly delayed, and public comments that once sounded confident but now feel like they were carrying a second meaning underneath. "We thought she was being strong," one viewer wrote, "but now it feels like she was surviving." That sentence spread everywhere because it captured exactly why this story is hitting people so hard. It is forcing them to rethink not just what happened to Wendy, but how often the public mistakes survival for strength simply because a person is still standing. And then there is the humiliation factor, which might be the most painful part of all this. Because even before the final collapse of that marriage became front-page gossip, there had already been years of whispers, cheating rumors, disrespectful behavior, stories that never fully went away no matter how hard people tried to move on from them. And now, with these new reports circulating, some fans are saying that cheating was never the full story. To them, it was just the visible part of something much uglier underneath. Because betrayal is one thing, public humiliation is another. But when people begin to suspect that the betrayal may have existed alongside deeper emotional control, that is when sympathy turns into outrage. And outrage is exactly where the internet is right now. People are dragging up every old headline, every rumor, every side comment from radio insiders,
former employees, and longtime viewers who say they always had a bad feeling, but never had enough to explain why. You can cheat on someone and still not be the reason they fall apart, one user wrote in a post that quickly went viral. But if you are cheating while also keeping them emotionally unstable and dependent, that is a whole different level. Again, that's public reaction, not proof, but it shows how emotionally charged this conversation has become. Because for many viewers, this is no longer just celebrity gossip. It feels personal. People watched Wendy for years. They laughed with her, judged with her, grew up with her voice in their living rooms and car radios. So now, watching her story get reframed in such a painful way feels almost like watching someone they knew get swallowed by a version of life they did not deserve. And then, just when emotions were already running high, another layer started to emerge. Some online discussions began pointing toward the possibility that Wendy may have stayed in the relationship longer than many people expected, not because she did not see the damage, but because by that point, leaving may have felt impossible on multiple levels at once. Emotionally impossible, financially messy, publicly humiliating, and personally unestating. Because once a relationship becomes tied to your identity, your household, your business, your routine, and the version of yourself you show the world, walking away is not just about ending a romance. It becomes about tearing apart an entire system you've been living inside for years. That is why so many people are now revisiting the final years of that marriage with fresh eyes. The moments where she looked exhausted but kept pushing. The times she spoke as if she was holding herself together through sheer force of habit. The scenes where she seemed less like a woman in love and more like someone trying to keep her life from collapsing in public. And if the reports now circulating are even partly accurate, then it would explain why her eventual separation from Kevin felt less like a clean break and more like the aftermath of a long emotional war. People think leaving is the end, one commenter wrote. Sometimes leaving is when the damage finally becomes visible. That line hit especially hard because it explains something many viewers are only now beginning to understand. Sometimes the person doesn't fully fall apart during the relationship because they're too busy functioning. Sometimes the breakdown comes later, when the adrenaline wears off, and there's no longer enough denial left to keep the structure standing. And that possibility has left the public deeply unsettled. Because if Wendy spent years holding together a world that was already cracking underneath her, then maybe what people later witnessed was not the beginning of the tragedy at all. Maybe it was the delayed consequence of everything she had already been carrying for far too long. And as that realization started settling in, fans began turning their attention to one final question that nobody seems able to answer clearly. If so many signs were allegedly there, if so many people now claim they sensed something was wrong, then why did nobody truly step in before things reached the point of no return? Because once that question enters the room, it doesn't just point at Kevin. It points at everybody who was around, everybody who
benefited, everybody who stayed quiet, and everybody who may have seen more than they were ever willing to admit out loud. And that is exactly why the latest reaction from people close to the situation is now making this entire story feel even more explosive than before. And that is exactly why the latest reaction from people close to the situation is now making this entire story feel even more explosive than before. Because once the internet started revisiting the past with fresh suspicion, attention did not stay on Kevin alone for very long. It quickly spread outward, pulling in old friends, former coworkers, longtime viewers, and even the people who once claimed they were trying to protect Wendy behind the scenes. And that shift is what has turned this from a messy relationship story into something much more uncomfortable. Because now the public is no longer asking only what Kevin allegedly did. They are asking who enabled it, who ignored it, who normalized it, and who may have quietly looked the other way while things around Wendy became harder and harder to explain. That is where emotions really started boiling over. Some people online believe the entertainment world failed her long before the public ever realized she was struggling. They argue that too many warning signs were treated like industry mess instead of signs that someone's life may have been spiraling in private. And once that perspective took hold, fans began going back through old clips with an entirely different kind of sadness. The jokes do not land the same anymore. The chaotic moments do not feel as funny. The awkward interviews feel heavier now. And the woman who once made a career out of talking about everybody else's scandals suddenly looks, in hindsight, like someone who may have been quietly drowning while still expected to entertain millions. That is the part that has broken people the most. Because even if none of these fresh reports ever become fully confirmed, the emotional truth people are reacting to still feels devastating.
The possibility that Wendy may have spent years trying to hold herself together while the people around her were either benefiting from the chaos or too afraid to challenge it is what has left fans genuinely heartbroken. "She gave everybody commentary while nobody really protected her," one viewer wrote. And that line alone hit people like a punch to the chest, because there is something especially cruel about a woman known for her voice, allegedly losing control over her own world while still being expected to show up, smile, and perform as if nothing was wrong. And now, with Wendy's first husband reportedly speaking in ways that have reignited so many old suspicions, people are once again looking at Kevin Hunter as the central figure in a chapter that many believe was far darker than the public was ever allowed to fully see. Not just because of the cheating, not just because of the humiliation, not just because of the betrayal, but because of the growing fear that there may have been a pattern underneath it all that was never truly addressed while there was still time. And if that is the case, then this story becomes more tragic than scandalous, because it means what people once dismissed as celebrity dysfunction may have actually been years of emotional damage happening in plain sight. The family was left divided in the court of public opinion. Fans are shocked all over again, and social media has turned into a battlefield of people arguing over who deserves blame, who deserves sympathy, and whether Wendy was failed by just one man or by an entire environment that stopped seeing her as a person and started treating her like a brand that had to keep functioning no matter the cost. And maybe that's the darkest part of this whole story. Because when someone becomes valuable to too many people, their pain often gets ignored for way too long. Their exhaustion gets rebranded as just going through a lot. Their silence gets mistaken for privacy. Their visible decline gets brushed off as gossip. And by the time the truth starts peeking through, the damage may already be far beyond what anyone can undo. That is why this latest wave of reports has people so emotional. It's not just because the claims are dramatic. It's because they force people to sit with a much uglier possibility. What if Wendy was telling the world she was not okay in ways people didn't know how to hear? What if the signs were there all along? What if behind all the glamour, headlines, ratings, and public drama, she was trapped in a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt impossible to survive from the inside? Those are the questions now haunting this entire conversation. And the truth is, whether Kevin Hunter ever directly answers these renewed allegations or not, the public has already started rewriting the story in its own mind. Because once people begin to suspect that what happened behind closed doors was far more serious than anyone understood, they
Stop looking at the old narrative the same way ever again. Now, every clip feels different. Every interview sounds different. Every smile looks different. And every silence feels louder than before. So while this may still be unfolding as internet commentary and unconfirmed reports, one thing is very clear. The way people see Wendy's past has shifted in a major way. And if more voices continue stepping forward, this may only be the beginning of a much bigger conversation about what was really happening around her when the camera stopped rolling and the lights went down. Because in Hollywood, in television, and especially in celebrity culture, the most painful stories are rarely the ones that explode first. They are usually the ones that sit quietly in the background for years, waiting for one person to say just enough to make everybody else start looking closer. And right now, that is exactly what the world is doing with Wendy Williams, Kevin Hunter, and the life that so many people are now wondering may have been far more heartbreaking than anybody wanted to admit. The public may not have every answer yet, but they are definitely no longer asking the same questions they were asking before. And now I want to hear from you, because this story has the internet completely divided. If these reports and resurfaced claims are even partly true, then it changes the way a lot of people will look at Wendy Williams' past, her marriage, and the people who were closest to her during some of the hardest years of her life. Fans are shocked, emotions are running high, and the more old clips and past interviews people revisit, the more questions seem to come up instead of answers. Do you think Kevin Hunter really had more influence over Wendy behind closed doors than the public ever realized? Or do you think the internet is taking old rumors and running way too far with them? And what do you make of the fact that so many people are only now starting to connect dots they say were right in front of everybody the whole time? Because honestly, this is one of those stories where every time a new detail comes out, it only makes the whole situation feel even heavier. And if more people from Wendy's past really do start speaking up, then this conversation could get even messier from here. So drop your thoughts in the comments right now, because I really want to know where you stand on this. Do you think Wendy was failed by one person or by everyone around her? If you made it this far, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update.
And if you enjoy deep celebrity drama, shocking breakdowns, and stories that have the whole internet talking, then you already know you are in the right place. Share this video with somebody who has been following the Wendy Williams story, because trust me, they are definitely going to have something to say about this one. And as always, I will be watching the comments, because something tells me this story is far from over.